Varun, good to see you. Thank you again. I know you'll have so much on.
No, happy to be here.
I have way more questions than we have time for, which is always a good sign.
I've got all night.
We're extending the curfew code base somehow. So Varun, I was wondering actually if we could start maybe with a quick introduction. So I'm assuming and hoping people had read the event page. I'm sure most of you have. So obviously your backgrounds in terms of Meta, obviously exiting your company onto your second company. I'm really keen to hear you describe your experience and how you did introduce yourself. And then, like I said, I've got like a million follow-up questions.
Okay, I think like most founders, it's been a winded journey, and I had no intentions of getting into tech or starting up a company. I grew up in India. I used to work in the film industry and then the advertising industry, doing post-production. If you know what that means, it's basically working in studios to get the stuff that you see and hear on television and film to sound and look all right. Did that for about 8 years, got completely burnt out working 7 days a week, and decided to do a master's program, which brought me to Edinburgh. And there was a program here at the University of Edinburgh that was focused on that industry that I was in, and it was the only one that was really interesting and that fit my criteria. So it was either that or just continue doing what I was doing back in India. And I came here, and to cut a long story short, from the sort of process of moving here and working on a bunch of projects at the university, I ended up meeting my co-founder, and we ended up starting up a first company. We were going to be a game studio, so we were going to build a bunch of games because one of our projects at the university was to build a game using GPS and phones. So this was 12 years ago, back when those were cool things. So Pokemon Go before Pokemon Go. And that led to us starting up this company where we thought we were going to make games. And that's when I learned to code for the first time, because it was just the two of us. He could code, but I could not, and we needed as many hands as we could on a keyboard. And that's what got me started on that whole journey. And somewhere along the process, we sort of swapped roles. He took on more of the sort of the business side of things, and I could continue to focus on the technology. And as we were thinking that we'd be at this games app studio, because again, this was 12 years ago, the App Store was the big thing where people would go to release these games and make money and build successful businesses. But we realized that we were pretty crap at making games, and but we really enjoyed building the technology. And that, I'm going to cut short a few steps here, but we ended up pivoting and focusing on the VR industry back in 2014. That's when it was time to really kick off, because a company called Oculus was acquired by Facebook, and they were acquired for at that point they said $2 billion, but more recently it was closer to the $3 billion range, and that sort of kickstarted this whole industry. And we thought, oh, we've got this cool technology which is all about making 3D audio experiences in games. We could just focus it on this VR industry, and that got us started there. And in a couple of years, we had our technology working really well. We started building tools around it as we started working with people in the space. And pretty much anybody at that point who was building something in VR was using our tech. So we got to work on really cool projects with Bjork and Massive Attack, down to the individual game studios across the world, as well as getting referrals directly from Oculus to some of their customers saying they need to use our tech, so we were like moving really fast. And we started going to the West Coast and East Coast of America quite often because a lot of our customers were there, just trying to learn from them, getting sneak peek demos into cool tech that was on the horizon. And we got to know quite a few of the people at Meta, Facebook, very well, because they'd come in from the Oculus acquisition. And on one of these trips, they just called us in and said, oh, could you just come in? We've been using some of your tools. We could just talk about maybe licensing. And we're like, oh, okay, here we go. It's going to be another sales conversation. We have no idea how we're going to price it for such a large company, but let's just go in and figure it out. We walk into this meeting room. So if you've never seen even photos of the Facebook campus, it's gigantic. We got there, it took us like 20 minutes to get to this building, and then 10 minutes to walk inside the building to get to this meeting room. And they were like, large meeting room with about 15 people. which was suspicious. We just got, I had a deck, I just went through it. My first picture was a photograph of Edinburgh, the castle, and a rainbow behind, and I made a joke about how we always have rainbows in Scotland and how happy life is and all of that stuff. So really, really cheesy presentation. Got into the details of like where we're going, our vision, our product, all that stuff, and had lots of really good questions from people in the room about how would we scale the technology, how would we make it work for lots of people, what is the impact of it that we could see on a product. Like, I just made stuff up. Then at the end of it, they're like, oh, there's this guy who introduced himself. He's in charge of like our business side of the company. He'll follow up and get a meeting with you tomorrow. I'm like, okay, that's fast. Like having a follow-up licensing conversation tomorrow is fast. But like, okay, we'll come back in tomorrow. So myself and my co-founder went back in, and it was a complete opposite. Really tiny room, 3 seats, just the 2 of us and this guy. And he walks into the room, opens the door, and says, "If you haven't figured it out, we want to buy your company." And we're like, okay. And he said, I'll just be back. I'm going to get a glass of water. I'm sure he'd planned for that because he gave us 5 minutes to like compose ourselves. We were going to be there, I think this happened on a Wednesday. We were going to be there until the Saturday because we were there for a conference. And after that, so he came back and we were like, oh, you know what, we need to speak to our board. We're not sure. We can't give you an answer. We need to think about it. And after that, it was every day a wine and dine constantly to just sell us on why it would be a good thing. And we just stalled, and we spoke to our chairperson and our non-execs, and they said, just leave. They're going to try and lock you in a room and get you to sign a bunch of papers. Just leave. Use whatever excuse you can. Just leave the country. So we left. We came back. It was a pretty fast acquisition by normal standards. It took, I think, if the ball was in their court, they'd have closed it in a week. It took a couple of weeks, and that led to us moving over to California. And I spent the next 4.5 years at Meta, and then moved back here in 2020.
What a start. I think I've got double the amount of questions now, Varun, which I didn't think was possible. One thing this actually reminds me of, and I'm going to try and not butcher the phrase, which was around acquisitions. I'm sure you might have heard this, where it's, what is it again? It's basically, it's much better to be bought than to try and sell. I think if you get what I mean, because what strikes me is you guys certainly weren't looking for it. And I really like your angle of, they were selling you, by the sounds of it. Yep. So tell us a bit about that. Like, why do you think that happened? I know some pretty nice obvious reasons, but yeah, keen to hear your take on that.
Well, after being on the inside and helping with a bunch of acquisitions from the inside of the company and evaluating companies that we could think about acquiring, I got to see how the whole machinery worked in it. And sometimes I'd have people from the corp dev team send me a slide deck of a company that was looking to sell. And that was always really hard to evaluate, because here's a company who's trying to sell you something that you're not even sure that you need. It's like, it's just like trying to just make a sale to a customer, except instead of trying to sell your product, you're trying to sell your whole company. And it's really hard to evaluate that. So which is why most of the good acquisitions end up being the ones where they're bought rather than sold. And it's for that reason. And also, depending on the kind of companies, most of the larger, like the Googles and Metas of the world, tend to work in a way where a corp dev team, which is usually the team that handles acquisitions, is involved in the organization and the mechanics around it, but it usually requires a champion in a product team within the company to say, this is what we need, or this is a team we need, this is going to accelerate something that we cannot do otherwise. And that was the reason they bought us, which was we had the technology and the tooling and a really strong community of people, as well as lots of big names working with us. And it just gave them an opportunity to accelerate that. If they had to build a team and do that themselves, it would probably taken them 2 years. And they got that in the matter of the weeks it took us to negotiate. And then our goal was to basically take a whole product, ship it to 2 billion people in 6 months. I thought that was going to be impossible. But we did it because we had a lot of help internally. But they got to where they wanted to do in 8 months instead of spending 2 years.
Fantastic. So I'm really keen to touch on your experience post-acquisition, because I know this is something that I guess in Scotland we don't hear a lot of, particularly with tech startups. So it's really refreshing to have that inside perspective. And as much as I hate this phrase, we are going to put a pin in that and come back. But we're speaking over email, Bruin, before the event, and I was keen to cover any questions you absolutely want us to speak about. And I know we're joking about anything that keeps you up at night, which sounds like nothing. You sleep very well. But if we did have to cover something, and I think you alluded to this at the start of your first answer, which was around the fact that entrepreneurship is a very winding road, and there's a lot of themes within this. And the homework I did, I read this Scotsman article, I think from 3 years ago. I know it seems like an eternity ago, but you did touch on this, I think, briefly, but also this whole notion maybe of failure a bit within that, and that's something that personally I'm really passionate about speaking about, because I think there is a bit of a stigma, not just in Scotland but in the UK, when it comes to failure, and that's obviously both on the founder side and potential investors maybe as well, though I don't maybe as much experience of that. So it's a very long way of asking you, Bruin, what's your take on the idea of knowing if you're building the wrong thing, and how that's obviously very different from looking for product market fit as your main goal?
I'll start with a really good colleague of mine at Meta. He was someone who's been in tech for a very long time. He was a really good manager, and we were sort of counterparts in the department we were in, and he'd worked at all the companies. If you can think of a tech company name, he's worked there. Right? And he told me, I was thinking of starting a company myself, and my wife told me I have a year to figure it out. Right? So he said, I gave it a shot for a year, and it didn't work out. But at the back of my head, I was like, that's not even enough time to fail once properly. Because it's such a non-linear path. It's never going to be the case. I think it's impossible to have an idea that is going to be right and perfect on your first execution, because there are far too many variables outside of your control. It's impossible. You might be really lucky. I've yet to come across a company who's got that story. And even for me, it's easy now to look back and paint this sort of linear path that we had from starting up a company to the acquisition point. But it never felt that day for a single day. It never felt the day a year later after the acquisition. Never felt like that 3 years later after the acquisition. It feels like that now because I've had all this time to absorb and almost put a framing and a narrative around it that makes sense. But in reality, it never ever feels that way. And which is why I mentioned failure, because if we always think about, we've got this, we think about success. It is extremely important to think about success. It's extremely important to be ambitious and to paint that success story, and which is why we've got ways in which we talk about. We talk about projections and cash flow and vision and slide decks and problem statements and all of that stuff. They're all ways in which we can talk about what success could look like, but it's really hard to get to that point unless you literally fail every day. And the number one goal for me at all points, especially doing this again, is, are we failing and learning constantly enough? And if we are not, it means that we're doing it wrong. And if at the end of it means that we've exhausted every single path to get there and have failed with every single path, and we've done everything in our control to get there, and we've still failed, that's it. That's a card we've been played. But if we haven't exhausted every single option and tried it out, then I don't think we're doing a startup right.
I think it's a really great perspective, and thank you for that. I'm really keen to highlight it, because I think there's always an element of, I guess to your point, obviously you look at the acquisition and that's all everyone remembers. And I think even if we look at some of the huge success stories around the world, failure is not just there, it's such a crucial element. And one thing that came to mind, and I'm not sure the right way to ask it, I guess, but in terms of practical advice on this, and obviously the failure and maybe feedback loop, and I'm sure everyone in the room has heard of, or maybe read, Eric Ries's Lean Startup. Like, that's kind of standard stuff. But if you were to give advice to people, and just show of hands, I know we're using Slido before, but old school wise, who here is a founder in the room? So who here is a founder? What sort of stage you're at? Maybe pre-seed, anyone? Bootstrap, seed stage? Anyone Series A later? Some more kind of earlier stage, I suppose. What sort of advice would you give to these founders in the room who are maybe going through that at the moment? So maybe feel like they're, hitting their head against the wall, getting lots of no's in terms of investment in sales and products. I know I've kind of gone a long tangent, but what sort of advice would you give someone to almost speed up that failure loop, if that makes sense?
So I think the key point here is that it doesn't matter what stage of the company you are. You could be making $1 billion of revenue. You could be making 50 or $100 billion of revenue, like many of the large tech companies, and they still constantly fail, and they fail very visibly as well. When we only see a small slice of those failures, but the lots that happen internally. And the approach there is, and this is something I learned working in Meta because I hadn't really formalized it previously, is you have to approach it like a scientific experiment. You've got a thesis, and that thesis can be as simple as it needs to be, and you define the criteria to test that in whatever way you can, and you run that experiment as quickly as possible, which could be as simple as I've got a form that I need to go and find 10 people to fill out, or a survey that I need to get 10 people to fill out, because I have got this assumption of how people think, and now I'm going to go and get 10 people to fill it out and actually see whether my assumption is valid or not. Now, whole other sub-caveats there. Are 10 people enough? Do you need 100? Do you need 1,000? Those will depend on your situation, but that's really the core of it. And if you don't start with the hypothesis, then you have no idea where you're going. So start with the hypothesis and figure out the quickest way to test that. And sometimes the quickest way to test that is to run a survey. The other time is to build a basic product. The other time is to build a prototype. Another way to do it is maybe you've already got a product and you need to test a feature out. So a big part of the sort of the Silicon Valley playbook is experimentation. You've got all of these technologies that you use to test anything that you're doing at a massive, massive scale when you've got billions of users to get some understanding of that. But you don't need that scale. Because usually the simplest way is to just go and speak to someone, and you just know how far off the mark you are in your direction. And I think there's lots of comfort as a founder in staying sort of within the walls that you've defined for yourself, and the walls that you've defined in yourself to just build what you're doing, because there's comfort in building something. But I think the thing you should be striving for is discomfort. Because if you're getting comfortable building what you're doing for so long, that means you're going to be really off the mark. So as soon as you start feeling really comfortable with what you build, it means you're already too late. Just go, and I found that again with what we're doing right now it's usually just a conversation with somebody. I just reach out to them and say, hey, could I just show you a demo of what we're doing? Could I just show you a prototype? And from that conversation, I just realize how far off the mark we are.
So we're going to come back to Meta, actually. So I'm going to pick up on the end of what you just said there. I think I was listening to something today. I can't remember what it was, but again, maybe some more practical advice. So I think especially in the UK, when you ask somebody something, especially with somebody you know, I imagine it's people you don't know as well, you're asking, there's maybe a tendency to lean on the positive side and say, oh yeah, that was great. Or, I really like what you're doing and this is important. So I guess in terms of practical advice, so you're doing these demos, for instance, what sort of questions are you asking people to really tease out the truth, basically, as brutal as it might be sometimes?
It's not just a UK thing. I think it's a universal human thing, and there are different cultures layer it differently. Something that we used to do when we were here and we used to travel over to America to sell products in our first company, we'd be like, okay, time to reboot, speak a different language. We need to because we couldn't use the same words we were speaking here to sell what we were doing, because we just come across as being these, little slightly not too enthusiastic people, which is maybe what we are. But when we are there, we had to just up it up a bit because that was how you sell in those markets. And it's a similar thing when you're testing something with people. And we usually, so my co-founder is much better than I am. We usually just write down 10 questions, and then we try and just look at it and see whether we're actually gaming an answer out of it. Are we forcing people to give us the answer that we want to hear? Or is there enough opportunity in these questions for us to actually hear something that we're not expecting? But as with most things, you could be wrong about these questions as well. So the only way to find out is by just doing it, constantly doing it. And we found that we reach a threshold, depending on the kind of people that you're speaking to, of you need about 20, 30 people. It's not that many. You need about 20, 30 people to understand whether you've got the right questions and whether these questions are really working for you. Because once you cross a threshold, you just find that people are giving you the same answers. You can almost predict the words they're going to say before they've even said it, because you realize that your questions can only sort of evoke that spectrum. And then it's a call of whether those answers are sufficient for you to harden your thesis and move forward, or you need to go and ask a bunch of other questions to speak to other people. I think the answer with all of these things is there really is no perfect answer. The only way to do it is by doing it.
I love that. I mean, the other answer is it depends, but that wouldn't be as good an insight. So keen to spend a good bit of time with your new startup. That works. Lots of questions on it. I am keen, however, to come back to your time at Meta. And I guess we have covered one of the big cultural things, and let me know if you have a different perspective on it, around the failure piece. So obviously, that's something, so we've done a few trips to the West Coast with some founders, and that's something we picked up quite early on, which is the failure. And particularly when you speak to investors out there, they kind of almost look out for founders who've been kind of beaten down slightly, but they're back with a second or third attempt, as a specific example. I'm really keen to hear about your experience, because I guess there's a lot of narratives and topics within this. You've got life post-acquisition, which I'm really curious about. You've got time within Meta, obviously one of the biggest tech companies in the world. You've got the Silicon Valley culture. So I guess I'm really keen to hear from you as much as you're keen to share, obviously, and whatever makes sense. A bit around your time now, like obviously you built teams, you've led teams there, you've scaled teams. Anything that you noticed that you think could be really relevant for the audience in terms of culture or lessons or anything similar?
Meta it's an incredibly well-run company. There are, as with all large things, there are parts that work less well and some parts that work better. But for the most part, it's a really, really well-run company. And that's, at least for me, so a good illustration for this is the acquisition. One of the persons from the sort of product organization who was once sponsoring the acquisition and sort of leading us through it, told me, I think it would be a good idea if you just come in and work as an engineer for the first year. Don't be a manager, don't do any of those things, just be an engineer. The good thing here was that his company was also acquired by Meta a couple of years before me. And so he was leading this acquisition, which was great because I was speaking to a fellow founder who'd been through the same process. I assume it was a similar sized acquisition as well. And I had my first meeting with my manager at that time. I walked into the meeting room, and her first question to me was, "So what do you want to do?" And that threw me off a bit because I did not really know what, I thought I'm in a large company, that there would be plans with a capital P, and there would be things with a capital T that I need to do. But it was up to me to figure it out, which threw me off initially because I didn't know the company, I didn't know the culture. We obviously had a product, and there were things that we were doing with it, but there was all these big picture things that were missing. And that basically is what the culture, that's how the culture is. And when I built teams, it was mostly about getting people on and just telling them, we've got all of these problems. These are how these problems line up to these goals set by Zuckerberg and anybody else who leads all of these different product areas. This is our scope and our vision, and this is our charter for our team, which is no different from saying, this is our company, this is the market we've chosen, and these are the criteria that we've set for ourselves, and these are the capabilities and the funding, which in this case would be the amount of people you can hire on your team, that we have. So how do we solve it? And that's pretty much how you figure it out. And people are graded, and they get their promos and they get their bonuses based on how well they go and solve those problems with as much agency as they can. And it's called a bottoms-up approach because you define these fairly vague, abstract problems, but you let everybody else figure it out. You let the people who've got the expertise, who are as close to the ground as possible, figure it out. And that's one of the reasons why the company has been incredibly successful. And that's also why there's a lot of criticism these days about how Google functions and the way it does things. But they both started from this sort of similar culture of giving individuals the agency to just go and figure it out. And coming in from a startup that was, well, initially it was hard. It just felt like I was running my own company again, which was very liberating.
So that's really interesting, because I think, to your point, you kind of imagine the opposite when you come in and it's like, this is what we're doing, here's a roadmap, here's a plan. I really like that approach, actually. It's a really good way of doing it, because I guess when you think of Meta, obviously it's been around for many, many years, and obviously dealt with many challenges, and still considered, obviously, a very, very strong company. I'm kind of half laughing. I brought a question, as what you have to share later, about Suck's Apple Vision Pro video. If we have time, we'll maybe come back to that. Not to obviously go on a tangent too much. So why don't we come back to your new startup? And one of the biggest things I was really keen to ask you was being a two-time founder. So you're back again, obviously, with a company. I don't know if you've seen the meme or the kind of thing around second-time founders, and it's all about distribution. And I'm really keen, basically, to get your thoughts on that, whether you think that's accurate or not accurate at all.
Yeah, there is an extension of that meme, which is if you're a founder doing what you were with your first company, your second company is always a B2B SaaS company, and your third company is not going to be a B2B SaaS company. And I think that's true. Well, it was, so I'm working with the same co-founder I had my first company, which is really helpful and makes it huge. It makes it much easier to just go through all of the motions again, and we can also skip through a lot of these motions because we've done it already. And trust and division of labor, all of these things are well understood because we've been working together for the past 12 years. So some of those things are easier. And so when we started off, we were really keen to go after a problem that that motivated us the most. What worked really well with our first company is that we had no background in games, we had no background in VR, we had no background in audio technology. We were not experts in any of those things. What really helped us were we knew the users really well. Because of my background in film and television, I knew the kinds of problems and workflow problems that people would face as soon as they started working with this new medium, and that perspective helped us come up with the right solutions. And so we were keen to find problems that would sort of follow that same pattern, because we knew we were not going to get a PhD in machine learning overnight, nor were we interested in doing that. We were just interested in just like diving really deep and finding problems worth solving. So we started this process of just sharing these. We'd write these one-page documents of a thesis and an idea that we'd had, and we just like swap it back and forth, and then each of us would critique it, or we'd go and find counter arguments. That was a really good process because it helped us sort of shake out a bunch of things. And from that, we just landed in roughly the space we are in right now, which was we were increasingly, we found the process of managing lots of information and teams within large companies as well as small companies really hard, because 10 years ago there was a dearth of data. It was all about, you have to have analytics and everything, and you need to go and find the information that you need to put in all of these things to grab all the data that you need to run a company. And 10 years later, it's the inverse of the problem. We've got way too much information to deal with within companies to actually effectively do a good job. And so we started in that problem space because it resonated with us hugely based on our own experience. It resonated hugely with people that we knew. And more importantly, we knew what the problem felt like, even if we were not experts in some of the technologies that we thought that could work really well. So the long story short, the new startup is really about solving how people communicate and find information in large companies and small companies as well, because the problems tend to be very similar. So you can almost think of it like an internal LinkedIn, but without all of the posting and other stuff that you see. But it's a forum in which you can share information within your company. But we automate a lot of those processes because we auto-connect to all of the tools that you use, whether it's task management, your metrics, your dashboards, all of that stuff, and using a combination of various models that are off the shelf or some of the AI models we've trained ourselves, we can summarize a lot of that information. So if you need to write up your monthly investor report, instead of you taking 2 hours and chasing down 5 people to get the information you need and then writing it up and then making changes, we can auto-summarize that for you in half a minute. And giving you the forum to then share the information. That's basically the thesis and the direction we're going in. Very different from what we did before, but arguably our first company was also very different from what the both of us had ever done before. And we just realized that that's our strength. We like being in areas that makes us incredibly uncomfortable. But as long as we feel like it's a problem that we faced and we've got a path, even if we don't, we've got a destination in mind, even if we don't have the path to get there, we'll figure it out.
So my mic's on. Lots of follow-up questions. So obviously you mentioned working at the same co-founder. That's something that I think comes up quite often in, like we've touched on with obviously failure and winding paths. Building a company is hard for everyone at the best of times. Quick show of hands actually, who here has a co-founder? Who's working? Is anyone solo founder keen for a co-founder potentially? I guess a nice range as usual. I'm quite keen to ask you about this because it strikes me that you both have obviously very different skill sets. So there's a nice complementary approach which we hear is obviously recommended. If somebody is maybe looking for a co-founder or keen to enhance that co-founder relationship, what would you recommend to somebody? So if somebody is looking for a co-founder, what should they look for in terms of maybe skills, maybe character, maybe chemistry?
I think the most important thing is to figure out what you can do together to build trust. And if that equates to writing a legal document, defining how you divide responsibilities, if that's what it takes to do it, and arguably that might even be a better outcome. Because you might be really lucky and you might be able to build a successful startup, and if you want to exit, maybe you might get to it, and in 2 years, magically, things might happen. But in reality, if you look at the numbers, most startups take way, way, way longer than that. And what that means is you're in a multi-year relationship, and as we know with all relationships, people change, people evolve, circumstances change, you run into personal challenges that you never would have foreseen. And so the step one at the start of this relationship, like with any other, is how do you just build that trust? So regardless of what directions you go in and whatever sort of course life takes, you have a basic foundation on which to build something on. I am amazed. I know lots of very successful solo founders, and I'm always amazed at how they do it because I cannot imagine not working with a co-founder, and I suppose that's in a way strength or a weakness of mine, which is I don't think I'd be able to do this by myself. So for me, it's really important to have a co-founder and someone who I can work really closely with, but also where we can just constantly challenge each other, because otherwise, I think if we were the same, it would be really hard. I know someone who's a CEO of a company, and I'd spoken to him about something what we're doing, and my co-founder and I wanted to have just run through some of our usual questions with him to get some feedback. And after the call, this friend of mine said, "Oh, your co-founder is the fun version of you." which is basically how most people describe it. But because for me, it's a meeting. Okay, have to get to it. I've got 30 minutes. Need to get through these questions. But he's usually, the person who makes a space, gets people comfortable, all of the people stuff, which I sometimes just fail on. So I think it's just about figuring out, as with any relationship, what that means.
And just on the support piece, obviously a co-founder is a really strong way to do that, and thank you for some really, really good insights there. Curious to ask about maybe an element of your mentoring approach, because you do a bit of mentoring for Codebase and TechScaler, if LinkedIn is accurate. No, is this? I'm really keen to, and I know we've covered a lot of bits, lots of advice this evening, but is there anything we've not covered that you've given as advice quite often recently when you're speaking to founders?
This is with the TechScaler stuff, as well as any other mentorship that I do outside of it, as well as all the people I managed at Meta as well. There's this thing in Meta where we wouldn't use the word manage, we'd call it support. And in a way that's true, because it was mostly about helping people prioritize what they're doing, which is also what you need as a founder. And hopefully if you have a co-founder or a board or investors or friends, co-workers, they can help you do that and sort of force you to do that. It's really hard. Second thing is just giving people the space to just talk about stuff in their life. Turns out that's a big thing, and it can make a gigantic difference in how people approach their work. Because I had people on my team who were going through everything from having a new child to going through divorces to going through all sorts of like curveballs life throws at you, and just having that space where we're just going to walk and chat about stuff made a big difference in how they approach their work. And I find that with many of the founders I speak to as well. It's just about giving that space and just constantly reinforcing, and this is something that I reinforce for myself as well, is it's normal. All of these challenges are normal. Being in this place where you've got too many options to choose from is normal. Being really, keyed in on a problem, on a burning problem that you want to solve is okay. The challenge of trying to find this balance between in quote work and in quote life is normal. Like all of these things are expected. It's more a question of what are the frameworks and what are the support networks you're building around you to work through that. And those are the themes that pretty much comes up in every single conversation I've had for the past 10 years.
Thanks so much, Varun. You've kind of read my mind. I was looking at one of the Slido questions, and it was similar in the sense of like overwhelm and what do you say to people who have a lot going on. So basically, read my brain. So got half hour in time. I am keen to come to a few Slido questions. So I know we're going to have to slightly arch our necks. I can be the question asker to save your neck muscles. We've got some really good questions, and I've just highlighted one at the top, which I'm actually struggling to read as well. But coming back to that point on San Francisco, so of course we've been through pandemic 2020. A lot of people on Twitter, now X, I suppose, speaking about that narrative around you don't need to be in SF anymore, and you can work remotely. But I'm quite curious about this. You guys in the audience, you might have seen TechScaler announced their San Francisco hub late last week. Obviously, that's a good piece of news and obviously really encouraging for founders to go out. Do you think it's important to visit often or even be based somewhere like San Francisco these days?
I think it's important to step out of the ecosystem and network you're in, full stop. If that means going to London, going to Berlin, going to San Francisco, that's a good first step. Because you're going to find that you're just going to hear different perspectives, or you're just going to be motivated by different things. And I think that's step number one. And all the more so if you can go to a place that has your customers or your potential customers or your potential users, because you can learn more quickly from them. So our default with our first company always was, I'd say, less about the location, but more about where was this sort of this critical mass of people that we could go and speak to, and usually that would be some kind of a conference, whether it was something local, something elsewhere in the UK, or somewhere in America, or somewhere in Europe, because the best connections we had were not in the conferences but around it, and this is something you probably hear often, to be running into someone, grabbing a drink with them later, and building up those networks, and those ended up being the most useful. And San Francisco, I think, so a lot of people talk about the vibe of going there and just speaking to people and just having this energy rub off and all of that stuff. I think it's true. It certainly is that way. I personally, I guess I've lived there for a while, but even prior to that, we'd always go there with with a set of goals. We're going there to meet X, Y, Z people, and we're just going to learn from them, or we're going to build new connections, or we're going to find more leads. So I think the plan is more important than the place, and then it's a question about finding the right place to execute your plan.
That's it. Thank you, Varun. Final couple of questions. Again, really stretching my neck here. Slightly left field, but is there anything, I know it needs to kind of seats a bit further forward. Is there anything you've changed your mind on in the last few years, and why?
So much, changing my mind daily. I guess, what do you want to talk about? Politics? So we can talk a lot. So I'm a big sort of, one of the most interesting and important books, at least for me, that I read recently is a book by a physicist called Sean Carroll. I obviously can't remember the name of it right now, but it's one of his most famous books. But it talks a lot about the scientific approach of doing things, and really frames a lot of the scientific progress that we've had in the past 100 years, especially post the theory of relativity. I'm not going to get into that, but the key thing here is to just have this, that for anything that you're doing, you've got a set of priors. That is, you've got an understanding of the world, you've got some preconceived notions that could be just based on your own experience, based on what you've heard from other people. And every single motion that you go through in life is you end up getting new evidence, and then it's a question of whether you use that evidence to change your priors or not. And that's also how things work, like with the startups. So specifically, in the case of the company, or even just starting up a company again, I found that a lot of specifically for the sector we're working in and the kind of product we're building, a lot of the playbooks that we'd see for user research, user interaction research, and all of that stuff just didn't work for us. We had to throw it out of the window. Only because we were going after, we are solving problems in how people work, and a lot of the challenges there end up being very different and very tricky, and the expectations of people as well are very different. That's just a minor example of how we've thrown some of those playbooks out of the window. Another thing is just defining what a minimum viable product is. Lots of schools have thought about this, lots of different takes. And it took us a while to actually figure out how we define it ourselves. And the only way we could do that was by speaking to people. And some people would say, oh, is this your MVP? It looks like a product. And the others would say, is this your MVP? I can't do anything with it. Right? So it took us some time to figure out where on that spectrum we are. And so all of the playbooks are great as a source of inspiration, as things that you can learn from, but you have to write your own way to figure it out. Also because everybody's got the same playbook, everybody's doing the same thing. So after a while, it just becomes tiresome, and you just need to just go in and speak to people and figure out what works.
That's it. I like that a lot. Final question for me, Varun. Actually, it's 2 in 1. Both quick fire. We'll be pleased to hear. So we've covered a lot. So much in terms of actionable insights, so many fantastic sound bites. I know this is such a podcast question, which I've stolen, so apologies in advance, but I do think it's a really good one, which is, if people only had one thing they could take away, I know, apologies in advance, I can delay and maybe let you think on it potentially. So if you had one thing they could take away, you know, you had a big sign behind you, whoever you want to ask it, what would that be if it was one message? And then to buy you some time, not that you would need it, is where can people find you? I know you're quite big on Twitter and X, LinkedIn, I guess, but tell us where people should come find you. And obviously that works as well in terms of website. And
That's the easy one. You can find me on LinkedIn with my name, but you'll probably find at least 1 million of me with the same name. So find me after this and we can swap QR codes or whatever. I'm on X with NTKeep, NTKEEP. Don't ask me why I've got that handle. That was the handle I created 15 years ago. I'm stuck with it. 2 places you can find me, or in real life as well. Happy to meet people anytime. As for the first question, I think I'll go with what I look for every day. And I'm just trying to answer one question, which is what I'm doing the most important thing I should be doing? And so with the startup right now, do I wake up in the morning and feel that this is the best use of my time and energy? Or could it be spent on something else that would be more valuable? And valuable there is whatever, to me, to society, to whatever the definition is. And I've just found that asking myself this question every day has been extremely useful to focus me on the tasks I've got ahead, but also to focus in my conversations with my co-founder as well as to like the product direction we want to take, the direction we want to go in as a company. And that has helped me sort of get through a lot of things. Also because as a second-time founder, many things are easier, but also many things are a lot harder because the markets are very different, the industry is very different. So in many ways, we are relearning things all over again. And I just need to ensure that I'm really motivated to be wanting to do this every day. And it doesn't come from a place of not being motivated, but it's a constant check to ensure that I am really as motivated as I think I am, because otherwise life is too short, etc., etc. I could be doing other things. And thankfully, so far, every morning I feel like I am doing the right thing. And that's sort of keeping me grounded and helping me move ahead.
Fantastic. Well, perfect way to finish. So many great answers, a really nice one to leave with. Well, thanks again, Varun. Like I said at the start, I know you have so much on, so I'm really, really grateful to have your time this evening. So do a quick round of applause for Varun to start. Yeah.